The little girl betrayed by her stepmother. 8 years later, she returns with a secret. A trembling voice, tiny fingers clinging for life, and a mother's heart turned to stone. This was the moment Lila Voss's childhood ended on a rusted bridge deep in the desolate riverbanks of southern Illinois, hundreds of miles from the only home she knew. Her father was Ronan Voss, a man whose name made grown men fall silent, an empire builder who controlled every shadow in the city. But as his daughter hung over the dark void that night, all his power and blood-stained money were useless to save her. This is a story of a sin that time couldn't drown, and a fate that, against all odds, refused to die. "Please, Mommy, don't let me go!" The little girl's voice shook like a leaf caught in the wind. Her fingers, small, frozen, and slippery, gripped desperately onto the wrists of Victoria Ashworth, while her body hung suspended in the air, right at the edge of the old bridge below. The river churned with a dark force, slamming against the rocks as though it were claiming something that didn't yet belong to it. Lila cried without control. Her legs kicked wildly in the emptiness, searching for ground that no longer existed. The wind whipped her dress and stuffed her mouth with freezing air. Her wide eyes, filled with pure terror, looked up at the woman she called Mom, hoping to find compassion. But she didn't find it. Victoria's eyes were stone still. No tears, no hesitation. Only a bone-deep exhaustion mixed with something far more dangerous: resentment. She'd married Ronan Voss 2 years ago, believing she'd become the queen of his world, but the doctors had told her she'd never carry a child of her own. And every time she looked at Lila, this breathing, laughing proof that another woman had given Ronan what she never could. Something inside her cracked a little more until there was nothing left but hate. "You've ruined my life," Victoria whispered, her voice broken but steady. "Because of you, I'll never be enough." Lila shook her head, sobbing. "No, Mommy, I didn't do anything. Please, Mommy, don't do this. I love you. I'll be good." The bridge was completely deserted. It was one of those forgotten places on the outskirts where the city's noise couldn't reach, where time itself seemed to have stopped. The concrete was cracked, the railing rusted, and nobody had crossed it in years. Victoria knew that. That's exactly why she'd chosen it. For 1 second, her hands tensed, her fingers tightened around the girl's wrists. Lila screamed, believing that was the moment she'd be pulled back to safety, but it was only a cruel illusion. Victoria's face hardened. "Everything I had is gone because of you," she said through clenched teeth. "My peace, my joy, my womb." And then, without a scream, without another warning, she let go. Lila's shriek tore through the night air. It was a short, piercing sound that disappeared between the wind and the echo of the bridge. Her small body vanished downward, spinning once before hitting the water. The impact against the river was violent. The water opened and closed immediately as if nothing had happened. Silence. Victoria stood frozen, her heart hammering against her chest. She looked down. The river continued its course, indifferent. For a moment, bubbles rose to the surface, then vanished one by one. No more movement. She breathed in once, twice. "It's done," she murmured. "It's over." She turned slowly, walked to the car, and sat behind the wheel. Her hands were shaking, but her face remained rigid. She started the engine and drove away from the bridge without looking back. What Victoria didn't know was that the river hadn't taken the girl's life. It had only taken her memory. And what fate hadn't revealed yet was that somewhere downstream, a 28-year-old woman named Harper Callaway, a woman who'd grown up with nothing, who'd survived foster homes and violence and every kind of abandonment the world could throw at a person, was about to pull a dying child from the black water with her bare hands. And that single act would one day bring her face to face with the most dangerous man in Chicago, not as his enemy, but as the woman he couldn't live without. If you're already hooked, smash that like button so more people can find this story. Share it with someone who loves a good drama and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. because what Ronan Voss did when he found out who threw his daughter off that bridge. That's a kind of fury this city has never seen. At the same time, only a few miles downstream from that same bridge near the quiet town of Grafton, an old, faded silver-gray pickup truck was creeping along a dirt road that ran beside the river. The left headlight flickered as if it were about to die. The right one had been dead since the week before. Behind the wheel sat Harper Callaway, 28 years old, thin, her hair tied high to reveal a slender neck marked with mosquito bites, dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep, and hands roughened from doing far too much work for someone her age. Everything Harper owned in this world fit inside a canvas backpack on the passenger seat. 2 changes of clothes, a box of adhesive bandages, $47 in cash, and a small faded photograph of her at 3 years old, sitting on the lap of a woman whose face she could no longer remember. That was her mother, or at least the woman the group home had told her was her mother. Harper had been orphaned at the age of 3 after a house fire in the middle of a winter night on the west side of Chicago. Her parents didn't make it out. She did because a neighbor smashed the bedroom window and threw her through the black smoke onto the lawn outside. From that moment on, Harper entered the Illinois foster care system and never once exited it through any door that led toward light. 7 foster families in 14 years. The first returned her after 6 months because they said she cried too much at night. The second kept her for a year and then chose to take in a newborn instead because it was easier. The third was where she learned that adults could smile during the day and beat children at night, where the foster father used a leather belt when he was drunk and the foster mother pretended she couldn't hear. The fifth was the one she never wanted to mention. The place where a 46-year-old man did things no one should ever do to a 13-year-old child. And when she spoke up, no one believed her because he was a church deacon, and she was just an orphan with no one to vouch for her. Harper aged out of the system at 17 with exactly 1 black plastic bag of clothes and not a single adult looking back. She slept in shelters, then in her car, then on benches at the Greyhound station, and worked whatever jobs paid cash the same day, washing dishes at a Chinese restaurant, scrubbing motel floors, waitressing at bars, anything that brought money fast. At 19, she met a man named Wade. He told her he loved her. It was the first time anyone had ever said that to Harper, so she believed him. 3 months later, Wade hit her for the first time. 6 months after that, he broke 2 of her ribs and shattered her left cheekbone in the parking lot behind the bar at midnight. Harper spent 2 months in a charity hospital. No one came to see her. No one called. On the day she was discharged, she looked at herself in the mirror at the faint scar running along her cheekbone and told herself, "You're not going to die here. Not like this. Not because of a man. Not because of anyone." She bought the old pickup truck with all the money she had saved and drove south with no plan and no destination, only the need to leave Chicago behind. That night, as the truck followed the riverbank, the headlight flickered and then went completely dark. Harper pulled over, cursed under her breath, opened the door, and stepped out to check it. Cold air cut into her skin. The river roared in the darkness. She was bent over the front of the truck when she heard something strange. Not the sound of water hitting rock, not the wind, but something weaker, thinner, like a small animal scratching at the surface of the water. Harper straightened and listened. The sound came again, this time followed by a choking cough. She ran to the riverbank. Thin moonlight spread across the black water, and she saw it. A tiny shape drifting into the shallow near the shore, face down, hair floating like seaweed, both arms limp. Harper didn't think. She ran into the water. The river was so cold it nearly stole her breath in the first second. The water rose to her chest. Her feet slipped on mossy stones, but she kept going. She grabbed the child's arm, pulled the body in, and rolled it over. A small bluish face, lips purple, eyes closed, not breathing. Harper dragged the child onto the bank, laid the body on the wet grass, dropped to her knees, and began compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breaths again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No response. She kept pressing, tears running without her realizing it, her mouth whispering like a prayer, even though she hadn't believed in God since the 5th family. "Breathe," she told the child. "Breathe. I'm not letting you die. You hear me? I won't let you." Then the child coughed. Water poured from the mouth and nose. The tiny body convulsed. And then a weak cry slipped out, so small the wind almost swallowed it. But Harper heard it. She heard it clearly. She lifted the child and pressed the trembling body to her chest, wrapped both shaking arms around it, and cried, not because of sorrow, but because, for the first time in 28 years of living, Harper Callaway had held on to something that didn't slip through her hands. "I've got you," she whispered into the ear of the child, shivering in her arms. "I'm not letting go. I swear I'm not letting go." A few hours before Harper Callaway plunged into the black water to pull a child onto the bank. That morning at the Gold Coast mansion north of Chicago began like every other morning in Ronan Voss's house. October sunlight streamed through the wide glass windows, spilling across the marble kitchen floor where a 35-year-old man sat flat on the ground, legs stretched out, his back against the cabinets, while a 6-year-old girl stood behind him with a deeply serious frown, her tiny hands busy tying a pink ribbon bow into the dark hair of her father. Ronan Voss, the man who only 12 hours earlier had ordered Kieran Frost to dismantle a money laundering operation that had dared to encroach on his territory on the South Side. The man whose name was whispered with the same reverence people reserved for storms and for God in every dark alley from Chinatown to Bridgeport. That man sat perfectly still on his own kitchen floor so his 6-year-old daughter could tie a bow in his hair without him moving an inch. "Don't move, Daddy," Lila said, her voice stern in the way only children could be stern without frightening anyone. "I'm not done yet." "Are you done, Lila?" he asked. "Not yet. If you move, I start over." Ronan smiled, the kind of smile no one outside this house had ever seen, the kind no one believed existed. This was the only part of the day when he was an ordinary man. Every morning he woke at 5 before Lila stirred. He put on a robe and went down to the kitchen to make pancakes, because that was the only breakfast she would eat. He sliced bananas into star shapes and scattered them on top because she said stars tasted better than circles. He poured a pitcher of orange juice and filled the purple plastic cup Lila called her princess cup. When Lila woke up, she ran down the stairs with her hair in a wild tangle, eyes still heavy with sleep, and her first words were always, "Daddy, how are we braiding my hair today?" Some mornings it was twin braids. Some mornings, a ponytail. Some mornings, Lila wanted to braid her father's hair first before her own. Ronan let her do whatever she wanted. He wasn't good at braiding at first. In truth, he was so bad that Lila cried from the pain. But he watched more than 50 tutorial videos on YouTube late at night after the house had gone quiet. And now he could do a French braid faster than any mother at Lincoln Park Preschool. No one knew that. Kieran didn't know. The men didn't know. The outside world only saw Ronan Voss in a black suit, cold eyes, a voice that never rose more than a single note. They didn't see him lying face down on the living room rug, pretending to be a monster while Lila climbed onto his back, laughing. They didn't see him reading Goodnight Moon every night in a steady, low voice until she fell asleep on his arm, then lying still for another 20 minutes because he was afraid to wake her. Lila's biological mother was named Margot. She died on the operating table. The doctors said they could only save one, and Margot had chosen before she went into surgery. "If you have to choose, save the baby," she said. Ronan never spoke of Margot to anyone. He kept her photograph locked in a drawer in his study, not because he had forgotten her, but because every time he saw her face, he saw the delivery room, the white lights, the monitor flattening into a single line. And he didn't want Lila growing up in a house where her father collapsed every time he passed a picture frame. He buried that pain as deep as it would go and made up for it by loving Lila twice as much as Margot never had the chance to. "Daddy, are you coming home early today?" Lila asked as Ronan stood up, the pink bow still dangling in his hair. "I'll try, my light," he said, bending to kiss her forehead, the scent of children's shampoo, milk, pancakes. He drew in a deep breath before letting go, as if he were trying to memorize the smell with every cell in his lungs. Then he put on his suit, stepped outside, climbed into the black Escalade waiting for him, and drove away. He didn't know it was the last time he would ever see that pink bow. The door closed. The mansion fell silent. Victoria Ashworth stood on the second floor, looking down through the window as Ronan's car disappeared at the end of the road. She didn't move until it vanished around the bend. Then she turned and faced the mirror. The woman staring back was 32, born into high society, daughter of a former Illinois state senator, educated in private schools, dressed in designer clothes, trained to smile at the right moment and say the right thing at every party. But that morning, the face in the mirror looked 10 years older. 2 years earlier, when Victoria married Ronan, she believed she had stepped into the life she deserved. Power, money, a man the entire city feared. She would give him a son, an heir, and her place in the empire would be unshakable. But 6 months after the wedding, a doctor at Northwestern Memorial told her that her womb couldn't carry a child. Not with difficulty, but not at all. Never. Victoria cried for 3 days in the bathroom without letting Ronan see. She went to another hospital, then another, then a private clinic in New York, then a specialist in Los Angeles. They all said the same thing. From that moment on, every time Victoria looked at Lila, she didn't see a child. She saw proof that a woman who was dead could still give Ronan something the woman who was alive, breathing, lying beside him every night, never could. That pain didn't disappear. It only changed shape. The first month, it was sorrow. The third month, it was anger. The 6th month, it was jealousy. By the 2nd year, it became something nameless, something thick and black, sitting in her chest, breathing with her every day. That morning, Victoria heard Lila singing in the yard below. The child was watering the flower pots she had planted herself, singing as she worked in the clear, bright voice of a 6-year-old. Every note struck Victoria's chest like a slap. She closed her eyes. She had been thinking about this for weeks. She had rejected it, prayed against it, cried over it, searched for reasons not to do it. But this morning, standing in front of the mirror, listening to the child's voice drift up from the yard, Victoria didn't resist anymore. It was no longer a thought. It had become a decision. She went down the stairs, stepped into the yard, and called Lila in the gentlest voice she could fake. "Come here, sweetheart. Go put on something pretty. Mommy's taking you out." Lila's eyes lit up. "We're going out, Mommy. Really?" "Yes," Victoria said, smoothing the child's hair, and her hand didn't tremble. "Just a little drive, you and me." Lila smiled. In her small heart, hope bloomed. Maybe today, Mommy really loved her. Maybe her nightly prayers had been heard. Lila ran inside to change, not knowing it was the last time she would walk out of that house on her own 2 feet. Victoria started the engine. The road ahead led toward the outskirts, the places the city forgot. Victoria drove for 5 grueling hours, watching the skyscrapers of Chicago vanish in the rearview mirror as she headed toward the desolate riverbanks of southern Illinois, and Lila sat in the back seat, legs swinging, eyes turned toward the window, unaware that every mile carried her farther from everything she had ever called home. Ronan Voss arrived back at the Gold Coast mansion at 8 that evening, 2 hours later than his morning promise. A bag of fruit from the farmer's market in his hand because Lila liked green grapes, and he always bought green grapes for her whenever he came home late. A wordless apology he never said out loud. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The living room lights were off. The kitchen was dark. There was no smell of food, no sound of the cartoon Lila usually watched before bedtime, no small feet running out to greet him the way they did every night. "Lila," he called, setting the bag of fruit on the kitchen counter. No answer. "Lila, Daddy's home." small flower pot on the windowsill, that small flower pot on the windowsill that she had watered that morning still had damp soil. He checked the bathroom, the playroom, the third floor, the backyard, the shed, the garage. Lila was nowhere. He called Victoria. The phone rang 5 times before she picked up. Victoria's voice on the other end was shaking, breathless, exactly like someone in panic, or exactly like someone who knew how to perform panic. "Ronan, I don't know what happened," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "I went out to buy a few things for about an hour. When I came back, Lila wasn't in the house. I looked everywhere. I asked the neighbors if anyone saw her. I'm sorry, I don't know." Ronan said nothing for 3 seconds, the longest 3 seconds of Victoria Ashworth's life. Then he spoke a single sentence, his voice low and flat, colder than any shout. "Come home now." He ended the call and dialed Kieran Frost. Kieran listened and said only 2 words, "I understand." 15 minutes later, the machine Ronan Voss had spent nearly a decade building began to move under a single order: find Lila. Dozens of men spread across the Gold Coast, Lincoln Park, Old Town, all the way down to Pilsen and back of the yards. Every bar Ronan controlled, every warehouse, every dock, every alley was searched. Kieran called in every connection inside the Chicago Police Department, not through official channels, but through people the organization had cultivated for years. Detectives and sergeants who took envelopes each month and looked the other way when needed. Tonight, no one was allowed to look away. The police report was filed at 9:45 that night. 6-year-old girl, Lila Voss, missing from her residence, last seen around 8:30 that morning before her stepmother left for errands. County officers arrived to take statements. Victoria sat on the sofa, eyes red, hands wrapped around a glass of water, reciting the exact story she had prepared. She went out. When she returned, the child was gone. The back door was ajar. Maybe the girl had wandered out on her own. She cried at the right moments, hesitated at the right places, and not a single detective in the room suspected her. Ronan stood in the corner, not sitting, not speaking, only listening. His eyes were on Victoria without expression. He didn't suspect her yet. Not now, because his mind held only one thing: where his daughter was. When the police left, when Kieran went outside to coordinate, when Victoria went upstairs and closed her door, Ronan entered Lila's room alone. He turned on the light. Everything was untouched. The small bed with butterfly sheets, the stuffed bear named Mr. Honey that Lila slept with every night, the drawing she had made of her father in crayon taped to the wall, a tall stick figure with black hair next to a tiny stick figure with curly hair. Underneath the uneven words, "Me and Daddy." The fuzzy bunny slippers lay beside the bed, neatly aligned, as if she still planned to come back and slip them on before sleeping. Ronan picked up the stuffed bear. It still smelled like her. Johnson's shampoo, milk, grass from the last time she played in the yard the afternoon before. He stood there in the middle of the room, the bear in his hands, and didn't move. Outside, dozens of people were tearing the city apart on his orders. His phone vibrated constantly, Kieran calling with updates every 15 minutes. Police reviewing security cameras, K9 units deployed around the neighborhood. But in this room, Ronan Voss wasn't a boss. He wasn't the man all of Chicago feared. He was just a father holding his daughter's stuffed bear and not knowing where his child was. His knees touched the floor before he realized he was kneeling. He didn't kneel because he chose to. His legs simply could no longer hold him. Ronan Voss had once knelt at his father's grave when he took over the empire at 23. Not from grief, but from oath. But tonight he knelt on the floor of his daughter's bedroom because of something no one in his empire had ever prepared him for. Helplessness. Power couldn't find her. Money couldn't find her. The fear he had planted across this city for years couldn't bring her back. For the first time in his life, Ronan Voss understood that there were things he couldn't command, couldn't buy, couldn't threaten, and couldn't control. He pulled the stuffed bear to his chest, closed his eyes, and whispered into the empty air that answered him, "Daddy will find you. I swear Daddy will find you." During the first week, Ronan didn't sleep. He turned the study in the mansion into a command center. A map of Chicago spread across the table, searched areas marked in red ink, his phone on speaker 24 hours a day, waiting for any call from Kieran or the police. He hired the 3 largest private investigation firms in Illinois to work in parallel, posted a reward of $500,000 for any information leading to Lila, and had people plaster his daughter's photo on every light pole, every gas station, every community bulletin board from Chicago all the way down to Springfield. In the second week, security camera results from around the Gold Coast began to come in, and that was when everything started to go wrong. Footage from Astor Street showed Victoria's car leaving the house at 8:30 in the morning. But when detectives requested footage along the route Victoria could have taken, 3 of the 5 cameras were reported broken. One camera's data had been overwritten due to a system error, and the final camera on the road leading toward the southern suburbs was completely blank, as if someone had wiped it clean before anyone had time to look. Ronan didn't know that the person behind the eraser was Victor Ashworth, Victoria's father. Victor Ashworth was 60 years old, a former 3-term Illinois state senator, a man whose name was etched on the honor boards of the Capitol building in Springfield, and in the debt ledgers of dozens of officials from county to state level. Victor hadn't known what his daughter would do before it happened, but when Victoria called him at 10 that night, sobbing and confessing everything, Victor didn't call the police, didn't shout, didn't tell his daughter to turn herself in. He was silent for 10 seconds, then said, "Don't tell anyone else. Let me handle it." To Victor, this wasn't a moral issue. It was a matter of survival. If the truth came out, Victoria would go to prison for attempted murder with aggravating circumstances involving a child, a minimum sentence of 20 years under Illinois law. The Ashworth family would be dragged into a scandal that would end any seat, any council, any board position in Cook County. And worse, Ronan Voss wouldn't wait for a courtroom verdict. Victor knew exactly who Ronan was. Victor acted that same night. He called the lieutenant overseeing the district police, a man Victor had helped promote 5 years earlier, with a call to the right person at the right time. He called the Cook County judge whose campaign he had funded. He called the director of the traffic camera department whose son had received a scholarship to Northwestern, thanks to one of Victor's recommendation letters. Call by call, old favors were collected, strings were pulled, camera evidence vanished. The detective assigned to the case was transferred to another division, replaced by someone less experienced and easier to manage. Reports to NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, required complete documentation from local police to enter the federal database. But the files submitted were always missing key information, missing photos, missing detailed descriptions, missing identifying features, preventing effective federal cross-referencing. Ronan didn't see the invisible wall. He only saw the result. No leads, no progress, no answers. All 3 private investigation firms reported the same thing. Every trail ended abruptly, as if someone had deliberately severed each connection before it could be grasped. By the 3rd month, Ronan began searching on his own. He drove to every hospital, every morgue, every orphanage within a 200-mile radius of Chicago. He carried Lila's photo, asked every person, looked into every child's face, and every time the answer was no, he drove to the next place. Kieran went with him on every trip, saying nothing, taking the wheel whenever Ronan was too exhausted to drive. The first year passed, then the second. In the 3rd year, Chicago police officially closed the case. The conclusion read, "Missing, presumed deceased, no new evidence." Kieran brought the report to Ronan. Ronan read it, folded the paper, placed it in a drawer, and said, "She isn't dead. Reopen the case." Kieran said the police wouldn't reopen it. Ronan looked at him and said, "Then we'll find her ourselves." And he kept searching. The 4th year, the 5th, the 6th. Hundreds of thousands of dollars poured out every year. No results. Throughout all that time, Ronan watched Victoria. He didn't accuse her because he had no proof, but something felt wrong, something he sensed with the instincts of a man who had lived his entire life among liars. Victoria didn't look for Lila. She cried when people were watching, asked about progress just often enough that silence would have seemed strange. But she never drove out to search on her own, never called the detectives directly, never stayed up all night staring at maps the way he did. Ronan never said it out loud, but he began keeping Victoria close, not out of affection, but because he wanted to see her every day, wanted to watch her eyes whenever someone mentioned Lila, wanted to wait for the moment she made a mistake. He didn't throw her out. He didn't divorce her. He kept her in the mansion like a piece on a board, one whose next move he hadn't yet decided. Victoria lived in that house as if inside a glass cage. From the outside, it looked like the privileged life of a powerful businessman's wife. Inside, she knew Ronan was watching her. She knew he was waiting. And that fear, combined with a conscience she thought had died but had only been sleeping, began to consume her from the inside, slowly, day by day, like a disease. While Ronan Voss was tearing Chicago apart, searching for his daughter more than 300 miles to the south, Harper Callaway was driving her old pickup truck through the night along rural roads with an unconscious child wrapped in her only jacket on the back seat. The child was breathing, but the breaths were weak and uneven, sometimes followed by a faint moan before falling silent again. Harper didn't know where to take her. She had no health insurance, no phone, no idea where the nearest hospital was. She drove only toward light. Just before 4 a.m, she saw a small roadside sign that read, Grafton Community Health Clinic, and turned in. The Grafton Rural Clinic in Illinois was a single-story white building with 3 exam rooms, a small emergency room, and 1 doctor on night duty. Harper ran inside carrying the child, her clothes still soaked with river water, hair plastered to her face, shaking so hard she could barely form a sentence. She told the doctor she had pulled the child from the river, that she didn't know who the child was, and begged him to save her. The examination showed a head injury, a large swelling at the back of the skull, likely from impact during the fall into the water or from striking rocks beneath the river. The child was hypothermic. There was water in the lungs, but not much, thanks to timely first aid. The doctor asked Harper if she knew the child's name. She didn't. If there were any documents on her. No. If Harper was family. No, I just found her in the river. The clinic called local police. A small-town sheriff arrived in the morning, took notes, photographed the child, and sent the report up the chain. But Grafton was a town of fewer than 700 people at the junction of the Mississippi River and the Illinois River, where the sheriff also handled patrol duty, and communication with federal databases passed through more layers of paperwork than a small town could move quickly. The report was sent, but back in Chicago, the hands of Victor Ashworth were already in place, blocking any information matching Lila Voss before it could reach the right eyes. The child stayed in the clinic for 3 days. On the second day, she opened her eyes. The doctor asked her name. The child looked at him with an empty gaze and shook her head. "Where are you from?" She shook her head again. "Where are your parents?" No answer. The diagnosis was complete amnesia caused by head trauma, possibly reversible over time, possibly permanent. The child didn't remember her name, didn't remember faces, didn't remember anything before falling into the water. Her world began the moment she opened her eyes in the small hospital bed in Grafton. Harper didn't leave. She had no money to pay the bill, nowhere to go, and only one reason to stay. She couldn't leave the child alone. She slept on a plastic chair beside the bed, ate bread from the vending machine with what little money she had left. And whenever the child woke in the night in panic, unable to remember who she was or understand where she was, Harper held her hand and said, "It's okay. I'm here. You're not alone." 2 weeks passed. No one came to claim the child. No calls from family. No missing child photos that matched in the system the Grafton police could access. No inquiries. The child existed as if she belonged to no one in the world. In the second week, Harold and June Whitfield came to the clinic. Harold was 72, had spent his life fishing and repairing boats along the Mississippi, his back bent, hands calloused, eyes kind. June was 68, a former elementary school teacher in town before retiring. Silver hair pinned up, known for bringing baked goods to clinic patients every weekend. They heard from a nurse about the unclaimed child and the young woman who had slept on a plastic chair for 2 weeks without leaving. June stood outside the doorway and looked into the room, saw Harper sitting by the bed, reading to the child from an old magazine picked up in the waiting room, and the child listening with wide eyes, silent, one hand wrapped around Harper's finger. June turned to Harold and said they couldn't leave these two alone. Harold nodded. They went in, spoke with Harper, spoke with the doctor, and completed temporary guardianship paperwork with the local child services office. In a small town, the process wasn't as complicated as in a big city, and with the endorsement of the clinic doctor and the sheriff, Harold and June took the child home. Opened the window for fresh air, and I opened the window for fresh air, and a flock of sparrows landed on the tree branch just outside the sill. The child stood up for the first time without help, walked to the window, and watched. Her eyes lit up just a little, but enough for June to notice. It was the first light on the child's face since she had opened her eyes at the clinic. June called Harold to look. "She likes birds," June whispered. Harold watched the child standing by the window, fingers touching the glass, mouth slightly open to the sound of bird song, and said, "Then we'll call her Sparrow." The name stuck. From that day on, the child with no name, no past, no memory, had a new name and a small home by the Mississippi River. Harper stayed 3 more days to make sure Sparrow was settled. She helped June tidy the room, helped Harold fix an old bed to fit the child, and each night she sat beside Sparrow until she fell asleep. On the morning Harper had to leave, she sat by Sparrow's bed. Sparrow looked at her with the eyes Harper had watched for 2 weeks, eyes that remembered nothing, yet trusted completely. "Will you come back after you go?" Sparrow asked. Harper held her hand tightly and said, "I promise." Then she got into her truck and drove away, watching in the rearview mirror as the small house and June, standing on the porch, holding Sparrow, grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared around the bend. Harper wiped her tears with the back of her hand and kept driving forward, not knowing where she was going, only knowing that for the first time in her life, she had made a promise she was determined to keep. 8 years passed. Ronan Voss was 35, and anyone who had known him at 27 wouldn't have recognized the man standing on the highest floor of Voss Tower at 3 in the morning, looking out over the Chicago skyline. He hadn't aged much physically, still tall, still solid, still wrapped in a perfectly tailored black suit. But something in his eyes had gone dark on the night he knelt on his daughter's bedroom floor, and it never came back. His empire, by contrast, shone brighter than ever, at least to the outside world. Voss Holdings was now the 3rd largest real estate and hospitality group in southern Chicago, owning 4 luxury hotels along Michigan Avenue, 2 restaurants listed in the Michelin Guide, and stakes in a chain of legal casinos in Indiana that Ronan controlled indirectly through clean names. Straw owners paid generously to sign papers and ask no questions. On the surface, Ronan was a powerful businessman, invited to charity galas, shaking hands with the mayor, posing for photos with the city council. Beneath that surface, he was still the darkness whispered about in every alley on the South Side. The underground network ran parallel to the legitimate empire, shipping routes along the Mississippi River, money laundering through restaurants and laundromats, illegal casinos hidden in basements of buildings that above ground rented office space. Everything was run by Kieran Frost with the precision of a Swiss watch and protected by the absolute loyalty of men who understood that betraying Ronan Voss wasn't a choice, but a sentence. Ronan was far more ruthless than he had been 8 years earlier. Before Lila vanished, he'd been cold but restrained, still able to tell necessity from cruelty. Now that line no longer existed. A courier delivered late by 2 days, and Ronan didn't ask why. He gave the order, and Kieran handled it. The man vanished from Chicago overnight and was never seen again. A business partner tried to skim 20% of profits, and Ronan invited him into the office, sat across from him, spoke a single sentence in a perfectly level voice, and the man signed a new contract with a hand shaking so badly the signature became a crooked line. In the underworld, they no longer used his name. They called him the Voss. 2 words, enough to make every conversation in the room drop to a whisper. But every night after Kieran left, after the guards returned to their posts, after the penthouse at top Voss Tower sank into silence, Ronan opened a door no one else was allowed to touch. Behind it was Lila's bedroom. When he moved into the penthouse in the 4th year, he had transferred everything intact from the Gold Coast mansion. The small bed, the butterfly sheets, Mr. Honey, the stuffed bear, the crayon drawing on the wall that said, "Me and Daddy," the fuzzy bunny slippers by the bed. Nothing was moved even an inch. The air in the room seemed frozen at the moment 8 years earlier, and Ronan wanted it that way. He stepped inside, closed the door, sat down on the floor with his back against the bed, in the same posture he'd taken years before on the kitchen floor, while Lila tied a bow in his hair, and he talked. He told the emptiness about his day, about the weather, about the restaurant on Michigan Avenue earning a Michelin star, about how he still bought green grapes every week even though no one ate them. He said, "Daddy's still looking for you, Lila. Daddy hasn't given up. Daddy won't ever give up." Then he sat there in silence, eyes closed, staying until dawn crept close before standing, closing the door and returning to being the man this city knew. Kieran Frost was the only one who knew about that room, not because Ronan told him, but because one night Kieran returned to the penthouse to retrieve forgotten files and heard Ronan's voice coming from behind the locked door. He stood in the hallway and listened to his boss, the man the entire city feared, telling his daughter that today Daddy braided French braids for little Lila from next door and still remembered how. Kieran turned and walked away and never mentioned it. Down in the Gold Coast mansion where Ronan no longer lived but still kept, Victoria Ashworth existed like a ghost in her own home. Ronan didn't divorce her and didn't cast her out, but he didn't speak more than 10 sentences to her in a week. She was allowed to stay, to eat, to be waited on, but not to leave the house beyond a radius Ronan approved, always with one of Kieran's men watching whenever she stepped outside. She was confined not with chains, but with the silence of a man waiting for her to expose herself. And Victoria's body was betraying her before her mouth ever could. An autoimmune disease emerged in the 3rd year after Lila's disappearance. Lupus attacking her joints, her skin, her kidneys. Doctors said prolonged stress was the trigger. Victoria knew it wasn't stress. It was conscience. The thing she thought she had killed on the bridge that night had only been sleeping, and now it was awake, living inside her, consuming her from within each day. Her hair fell out in clumps. Her skin broke into rashes whenever the cold came. Her hands swelled so badly some mornings she couldn't hold a glass of water, but she didn't dare tell anyone. Didn't dare call her father because every call could be overheard. And Ronan Voss didn't miss details. So she sat in the mansion staring out the windows, rotting slowly in silence. While on the highest floor of Voss Tower, her husband sat on the floor of an empty child's bedroom and spoke to a memory. While Ronan Voss sat in the darkness on the highest floor of Voss Tower, speaking to emptiness, more than 300 miles to the south, in the town of Grafton, Illinois, another world existed, quiet, small, and filled with a kind of light Chicago could never hold. Harper Callaway was 28, 8 years after the night she waded into black water and pulled a child onto the bank. Her life had changed, not in the way miracles happen, but in the way a person clenches her teeth and climbs one step at a time while everything around her tries to drag her back down. After leaving the Whitfield house that day, Harper drove south for another 2 hours and stopped in a small town near St. Louis. waitressed for 4 months, cleaned motel rooms for 3, then returned to Grafton because she realized she couldn't go any farther from the child she had promised to come back to. She rented a small room above an old bookstore on Grafton's main street, paid part of the rent by helping clean the shop each morning, and worked nights at the only diner in town that stayed open till 10. A year later, she applied to the nursing program at Lewis and Clark Community College in Godfrey, a 30-minute drive from Grafton. She qualified for a Pell Grant because her income fell below the federal poverty line, covered the rest with financial aid and night shifts, and over 4 years didn't miss a single day except for exams. She passed the NCLEX on her first attempt and became a registered nurse at 25. Now she worked the night shift at Grafton Community Hospital, 12 hours from 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning, returned to her room at dawn, slept until noon, then woke to prepare food and drive to the Whitfield house. Every week without missing 1 in 8 years, the promise Harper made to Sparrow on the day she left, she kept with every drive, every home-cooked meal, every afternoon spent on the Whitfield porch watching Sparrow grow. Sparrow was 14. She was no longer the 6-year-old with empty eyes staring at birds through a window. Now she was a quiet teenager, reserved, soft-spoken. But when she spoke, each sentence carried more weight than her age suggested. Sparrow loved to draw. She sketched river landscapes in pencil and watercolor, the surface of the water at dawn, sparrows perched on branches outside the window, Harold's wooden boat tied at the dock. Her paintings were calm and beautiful, but June had noticed the same thing in everyone for years now. Water was always there. Rivers, rain, ponds, mist, as if water called to her, and she didn't know why. At night, Sparrow sometimes dreamed. Not clear nightmares, just shapeless fragments, the sensation of falling, wind, darkness, and hands. She didn't know whose hands they were, didn't know whether they were holding or letting go, only that every time she woke from those dreams, she cried without understanding why. When June heard her, she came into the room, sat beside the bed, stroked Sparrow's hair, and told stories until she slept again. Folk tales, fairy tales, stories June invented about a small sparrow flying through a storm and finding its way back to its nest. During the day, Harold taught Sparrow different things. He taught her how to fish in the shallow bend of the river, how to tie boat lines, how to read the current to know where fish gathered and where hidden rocks lay. He didn't speak much. Harold never had. But whenever Sparrow asked a question, he answered with the patience of a man who understood this child needed steadiness more than anything else. Briar Whitfield, Harold and June's 20-year-old granddaughter, was the only person who made Sparrow laugh out loud. Briar visited on weekends, dragged Sparrow along the riverbank, caught fireflies at night, talked endlessly about everything from movies to her boyfriend at college. Briar was loud, bright, full of energy, the complete opposite of Sparrow, and perhaps that was why they fit. Sparrow listened to Briar for hours without tiring, and Briar accepted Sparrow's silence without asking her to explain it. Life in the Whitfield house was simple. Early mornings, Harold went to the river, and Sparrow joined him when she wasn't in school. Afternoons, June cooked. Evenings, Sparrow drew on the porch. Nights, June told stories. And every week, Harper arrived with food, medicine for the elders, and a tired but constant smile. To Sparrow, Harper was Sister Harper, the only adult beyond her grandparents she trusted without question. She didn't know why Harper mattered so much to her, didn't remember the night on the river, didn't remember the hands that pulled her from black water. But whenever Harper stepped onto the porch, something warm stirred in Sparrow's chest in a way she couldn't explain, as if her body remembered something her mind had forgotten. Beneath that peace, though, a question never stopped existing. Harper thought about it every night on the drive from the hospital back to her rented room. Harold and June mentioned it whenever Sparrow had fallen asleep, and they sat on the porch drinking tea in silence. Where had the child come from? Who had done that to her? Why had no one ever looked for her? 8 years and not a single person appeared. No father, no mother, no one. as if Sparrow had fallen from the sky and the river had kept her for them. Harper didn't believe that. She knew the child hadn't fallen into the river on her own. Someone had put her there, and one day she feared that person would come back. Paige Holloway wasn't the kind of lawyer who sat in an office waiting for files to come to her. She was 32, a graduate of the University of Chicago Law School. Sharp, patient, and one of the very few people Ronan Voss trusted. Not out of fear, but out of competence. Paige began working for Ronan in the second year after Lila disappeared, when the third private investigation team in a row reported no results, and Ronan needed someone with a legal mind to dig into corners ordinary detectives never touched. For 6 years, Paige traced every possible path. Coroner records across Illinois, lists of unidentified children admitted to major hospitals in Chicago, Rockford, Springfield, and Peoria, adoption files through child services, even new student registrations at elementary schools within a 300-mile radius of Chicago that matched the age and description. Nothing matched, or more precisely, Victor Ashworth had made sure nothing was allowed to match. But Victor Ashworth, powerful as he was still human. And the wall he built had a gap he never anticipated: the rural healthcare system. Small clinics in towns under 1,000 residents often kept patient records on paper or on internal electronic systems, not connected to large hospital networks. They sat outside the reach of any centralized search and beyond Victor's grasp because he focused on blocking information at police levels and federal databases. Never thinking about a tiny clinic in a town he didn't even know by name. Paige began reviewing this system 6 months earlier in a methodical sweep, sending record requests to every clinic, every rural practice, every small community hospital along the lower Mississippi River and Illinois River, searching for any record of a child under 10 admitted during the window when Lila vanished. Most yielded nothing until an envelope from Grafton Community Health Clinic arrived at her office on a Tuesday afternoon. Inside was a copy of a handwritten medical record, the paper yellowed with age bearing an admission date that matched the night Lila disappeared exactly. Patient, female child. Estimated age 6, identity unknown, symptoms, head trauma, hypothermia, water in lungs, complete amnesia. Brought in by young woman, full identity not provided, stated she found the patient drifting in the river, blood type B positive. Identifying marks, small crescent-shaped scar on the left side of the forehead. Paige reached the last line and stopped. She opened Lila Voss's original file, the one she always carried in her briefcase. Blood type B positive. Crescent-shaped scar on the left forehead from a fall down the stairs at age 4. Her hands shook. She read it again, then picked up the phone and called Ronan. Ronan answered on the first ring the way he always did when Paige called, because Paige never called without reason. Paige spoke slowly and clearly, one word at a time, saying she had found a medical record at a clinic in Grafton, Illinois, roughly 300 miles south of Chicago, documenting a female child about 6 years old, admitted on the exact night Lila disappeared. Head injury, amnesia, pulled from a river, matching blood type, matching forehead scar. Silence followed. Paige heard Ronan's breathing on the other end, heavier than usual, then no breath at all for 3 seconds, as if he had forgotten how to breathe. Then Ronan asked in a voice unlike the flat, controlled tone Paige had known for 6 years, a voice of a man struggling not to break apart. "Who brought her in?" Paige replied that the record listed a young woman, identity incomplete, no contact information, but that she could go to Grafton in person to trace the clinic trail and find her. Ronan said nothing for 5 seconds. Then he spoke, and for the first time in 8 years, Paige heard something in his voice she hadn't believed he could still produce. Hope. As he said, "Find that woman. Find her at any cost." Ronan didn't wait until morning. 2 hours after Paige's call, he was already in a black Escalade racing south on Interstate 55. Kieran driving, a security SUV following behind. Paige had sent him the address of the Grafton Clinic, the name of the night duty doctor from 8 years earlier, who had since retired. And the most critical detail of all, the young woman who brought the child in that night likely still lived in the area because temporary guardianship records from Child Services listed a witness named Harper Callaway, who had signed confirmation when the Whitfields took the child in. Paige dug further. Harper Callaway, 28, registered nurse, currently working the night shift at Grafton Community Hospital. Ronan read that message on his phone and said nothing for the entire 4-hour drive. Kieran had known his boss long enough to understand that when Ronan went silent like this, it wasn't calm. It was restraint, the kind that held everything inside, because if it broke loose, it might never be contained again. The convoy reached Grafton at 1:45 in the morning, a town of fewer than 700 people, streets swallowed by darkness, only a few weak yellow streetlights and the sound of the Mississippi River moving somewhere unseen. 2 glossy black SUVs parked in front of the community hospital, like shadows that had wandered into the wrong place. Ronan stepped out. Kieran followed. The guards stayed behind by order. At night, Grafton Community Hospital had 1 nurse on duty, 1 doctor on call from home if needed, and pale fluorescent lights stretching down empty hallways. Ronan pushed the door open at 2 in the morning. The sound of leather shoes echoed on tile in the silent corridor. Harper Callaway was seated at the nurse's station at the far end of the hall, hair tied high, light blue scrubs charting patient notes. She looked up at the sound of footsteps and saw a tall man in a black suit walking straight toward her with the stride of someone used to the world clearing a path. Behind him was another man, larger, colder, keeping 3 steps back like a shadow. Harper sat down her pen and stood. Her instincts, sharpened by 28 years of surviving dangerous people, told her this man wasn't a patient, wasn't family, and wasn't someone who belonged in a rural hospital at 2 in the morning. "How can I help you, sir?" Harper asked, her voice steady, her eyes never leaving him. Ronan stopped at the counter and looked at her. He wasn't used to being met with an unflinching gaze. But the woman in front of him was doing exactly that. "Are you Harper Callaway?" Ronan asked. Harper's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who's asking?" "My name is Ronan Voss. I'm looking for information about a child brought to a clinic in this area 8 years ago. A girl about 6 years old. Head injury, amnesia, pulled from the river." Harper's heart skipped a beat, but her face didn't change. She knew instantly who he meant. For 8 years she had waited for and feared this moment. The moment someone would come asking about the child. She didn't let that fear show. "Why are you looking?" "Because she's my daughter." Silence. Harper studied him, measuring every line of his face, searching for lies, for danger, for anything that would give her a reason not to believe him. "Do you have proof?" Ronan wasn't used to being asked to prove anything. In his world, he spoke, and people believed him or pretended to because they were afraid. But he reached into his inner jacket pocket and placed an envelope on the counter. Inside were photographs of Lila at 5 years old, the original birth certificate stamped by Cook County, and blood type records. Harper opened it and examined each page, slowly and carefully. She looked at the photo of the curly-haired child smiling wide and saw Sparrow there. The same lines of the face, the same eyes, the same curve of the mouth. Her chest tightened, but she said nothing. She closed the envelope, set it down, and met Ronan's eyes. "Even if she is your daughter, I need to know why a 6-year-old child ended up floating in a river in the middle of the night, and why no one came looking for her for 8 years. Ronan stood still. The question struck straight into the deepest wound he had carried all this time. He answered in a voice lower than usual. "I looked. Every day for 8 years. Someone stopped me." Harper didn't nod or shake her head. She said, "I don't know who you are beyond the name on that birth certificate. I don't know if you're here out of love or something else, and until I'm certain, I won't tell you anything about that child." Kieran took a step forward, the reflex of a man conditioned to protect his boss when someone dared refuse him. Ronan raised a hand to stop him without turning his head. Harper glanced at Kieran, then back at Ronan, and continued in a flat, even voice. "You can buy this entire town, but you can't buy my trust. If you want my help, you come alone. No guards, no weapons, no threats. You come as a father, not as whatever you are out there, and I'll decide for myself whether that child is safe with you." Ronan looked at her. In 8 years, no one in his life, not Kieran, not Paige, not an enemy or ally, had spoken to him that way. And the person doing it wasn't a rival boss, not a politician, not a lawyer, but a night shift nurse in a town of 700 people barely over 5 feet tall. Thin, dark circles under her eyes, standing in light blue scrubs and refusing to kneel. "All right," Ronan said. Kieran turned to look at him, and in 10 years working for Ronan Voss, it was the first time Kieran Frost had ever seen his boss yield to anyone. The next day, exactly as Harper had said as her condition, Ronan came alone. No Kieran, no guards, no black SUVs. He rented an ordinary car from the town's only hotel and followed Harper's directions along the dirt road that ran beside the river toward the Whitfield house. Harper sat in the passenger seat and said nothing during the 15-minute drive. She had called Harold and June the night before and told them everything, that a man had come looking for Sparrow, that he claimed to be her biological father, that he had documents and photographs, and that she believed he was telling the truth, but needed them to meet him before any decision was made. June cried on the phone. Harold was silent for a long time and then said only this, "Bring him here. I'll know by looking into his eyes." Ronan stopped the car about 50 meters from the house because the dirt road was too narrow to go farther. He stepped out and looked straight ahead. A small one-story wooden house with weathered white paint, a gray tin roof, a wide porch with 2 old wooden chairs, and a child sitting on the porch steps with a sketch pad on her lap and a pencil in her hand. Ronan stopped moving. The child was 14, brown curls falling over her shoulders, head bent in concentration over her drawing. She didn't hear the car, didn't know someone was standing 50 meters away looking at her as if at a miracle. Ronan didn't move. His eyes locked onto the child, brown curls just like Margot. The curve of the cheekbones like Margot, but the way the girl frowned when she concentrated, the angle of her head, the eyes when she lifted them to follow birds flying past. Those were his eyes. Ronan saw himself in that child, and 8 years crashed into him all at once. He didn't fall. His legs buckled slowly, not suddenly. The kind of collapse that happens when a body simply can't carry the weight of what it feels. Harper reached out to steady him, but she was much smaller, able only to hold his arm, so he didn't go all the way down. Ronan dropped to one knee on the dirt road. One hand braced on the ground and made no sound. He cried without sound. Tears fell without sobs, without broken breaths, only silence and tears. The kind of crying that comes from a man who forgot how to cry long ago and whose body remembers only the tears. Sparrow looked up. She saw a strange man kneeling in the dirt road and a familiar woman standing beside him. "Sister Harper," she called, standing, her voice worried. "What's wrong with him?" Harper stepped onto the porch, sat beside Sparrow, and wrapped one arm around her shoulders. Harper spoke softly. "Sparrow, he came a very long way to be here. I need to tell you something." Sparrow looked at Harper, then at the man struggling to stand, wiping his face with the back of his hand and trying to walk toward the porch on unsteady legs. In Sparrow's eyes was the fear any child feels when seeing an adult cry, especially a stranger looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. At that moment, the front door opened. Harold stepped out first, his back straighter than usual, his gaze fixed on Ronan below the porch. June followed, her hands clasped tight at her chest, eyes already red. Harold looked at Ronan in silence, the way an old man measures a younger one by the only measure he trusts, the eyes. Ronan met Harold's gaze without hiding anything. His eyes then weren't the eyes of a boss, not of a CEO, not of the darkness Chicago feared. They were the eyes of a father who had just seen his daughter after 8 years and was doing everything he could not to collapse again. Harold nodded once as if he had seen enough. Harper looked at Sparrow, took her hand, and said, "This man is your biological father, Sparrow. He's been looking for you for a very long time." Sparrow looked at Ronan, eyes wide, not understanding, not remembering, but no longer afraid. She looked at him for a long moment, then asked in a small voice, "How long have you been looking for me?" Ronan opened his mouth, but no sound came. He swallowed once, then again, and finally spoke, his voice shaking so badly each word seemed pulled from his chest. "Every day for 8 years. Every single day." Sparrow said nothing. She looked down at Ronan's shoes, dirty with road dust, at his hands still marked with earth from where he had knelt, at his eyes red and wet, and she said, "I don't remember you. I'm sorry." Ronan shook his head. "You don't have to remember me. I just need to know you're alive. You being alive is enough." June stepped down from the porch, tears flowing without control, and Harold stood beside her, holding her hand. Ronan turned to them and did something no one in his empire had ever witnessed. He dropped to both knees in front of the two elders. He spoke, his voice breaking. "Thank you. Thank you for saving my daughter. Thank you for raising her. Thank you for giving her a life I couldn't give her for 8 years. I owe you a debt I can never repay." Harold stepped forward, bent down, grasped Ronan's arms with the strength of a man who had worked rivers his entire life, pulled him to his feet, and said in a rough, low voice, "Stand up, son. We don't need repayment. We only did what our hearts told us to do." Then he turned, opened the door, and called into the house. "Come inside, all of you. Standing out here in the cold wind isn't good." Ronan Voss didn't return to Chicago. That night, he called Kieran and said 2 sentences. "I'm staying here. You handle everything back home." Kieran didn't ask how long because he knew the answer would be until I decide to come back. The only hotel in Grafton was a 2-story roadside inn with 10 rooms on the main street, the kind where the bed creaked when you turned, and the hot water lasted only 15 minutes at a time. Ronan rented the largest room, which was barely half a meter wider than the others, set his laptop on an old wooden desk, and turned it into a remote command center for his empire. Every morning, he met with Kieran by phone, reviewed contracts by email, and made decisions for a network stretching from the south side of Chicago to Indiana through brief calls that never lasted more than 3 minutes. The rest of the day, he gave to Sparrow. But he didn't rush. Harper told him from the beginning that he couldn't force a 14-year-old child with no memory of him to call him dad within a week, that he had to let her adjust. Ronan listened, and he followed it. Something that surprised even himself because he wasn't a man accustomed to following anyone. On the first day, he went to the Whitfield house and simply sat on the porch 3 meters away from Sparrow in silence while she drew. Sparrow glanced at him a few times, said nothing, and went back to drawing. The second day was the same. On the third day, Sparrow asked if he liked drawing. Ronan answered honestly that he didn't know how to draw. Sparrow looked at him for a moment, tore a sheet from her sketch pad, handed it to him with a pencil, and said, "Then practice." Ronan held the pencil for the first time in years, not to sign contracts or approve orders, but to draw a bird that looked more like a chicken than any bird. Sparrow looked at the drawing and didn't laugh, but the corner of her mouth twitched. That was the first step forward. On the 5th day, Harold invited Ronan to go fishing. Ronan had never held a fishing rod in his life, but he sat on the old wooden boat in the middle of the Mississippi River with Harold and Sparrow from morning until noon, caught nothing, but watched Sparrow laugh when she pulled a small fish into the boat, and he understood that this was the first time in 8 years he had felt something that resembled happiness. Harper watched it all. She wasn't always there because her 12-hour night shifts took her mornings for sleep, but every afternoon she came to the Whitfield house, and she saw everything. She saw Ronan sit for hours by the river watching Sparrow fish, without impatience, without checking his phone, without pacing the way men used to controlling everything did. She saw him hold the drawing Sparrow gave him with both hands, careful and gentle, as if it were more valuable than any multi-million-dollar contract he had ever signed. She saw him listen to Harold's fishing stories without interrupting, nodding in the right places, asking the right questions, and she began to see something she hadn't expected. That beneath the darkness this man carried, there was something still intact, buried deep, but not dead, like the roots of a burned tree, still alive underground. Ronan watched Harper, too. Not intentionally at first, but gradually he couldn't help it. He saw her work 12-hour night shifts, return to her rented room at dawn, sleep until noon, wake to cook, then bring food to the Whitfield house every afternoon, containers of soup, trays of lasagna, homemade bread. She didn't have much money. He knew that. The room above the old bookstore, the old pickup truck, a small rotation of clothes. Yet every week she still brought food to the Whitfields, bought medicine for Harold when his back hurt, bought new sketchbooks for Sparrow when the old ones ran out. She gave everything she had while keeping almost nothing for herself. Ronan didn't understand that. In his world, people gave to get something back. Every favor had a price. Every kindness was an investment. But Harper Callaway gave and expected nothing. She did it because she wanted to, because she loved these people, and because she didn't need repayment. Ronan didn't know what to call the thing stirring in his chest when he watched her, but it was there, smoldering, growing heavier by the day. There were small moments they both pretended not to notice. One afternoon, Harper made coffee in the Whitfield kitchen, poured 3 cups for Harold, June, and herself, then automatically poured a 4th no one had asked for and set it at the corner of the table where Ronan usually sat. She said nothing. He said nothing. He drank the cup. One morning, Harper finished her shift at 7, stepped out of the hospital into the pale early light, and saw the rental car Ronan was using parked in the lot. He sat inside with the window halfway down, reading something on his phone. When he saw her, he didn't wave or call out. He simply started the engine and followed her slowly along the road from the hospital to her rented room, waiting until she unlocked the door and stepped inside before turning around and leaving. Harper didn't ask why he was there. He didn't explain. The next day, he was there again. And the day after that, neither of them spoke about it. But every morning when Harper stepped out of the hospital and saw the familiar car parked at the edge of the lot, something warmed in her chest in a way she wouldn't allow herself to name because she knew who he was. She knew the world he came from, and she knew that allowing herself to feel anything for him was stepping into a place she might not be able to leave. The incident happened on a Saturday afternoon, 3 days after the night Harper was assaulted at the hospital. Briar came to visit her grandparents for the weekend as usual and dragged Sparrow down to the riverbank to catch fireflies, even though it was still daylight, because Briar said evening fireflies were different from night fireflies, and Sparrow didn't bother arguing since arguing with Briar was the most pointless thing in the world. The two of them walked along the river to Harold's dock, where the old wooden boat was tied with a rope looped around a weathered post. Briar climbed onto the boat first. Sparrow followed. The riverbank was still damp from the rain the night before. Moss slick on the rocks, and when Sparrow stepped onto the edge of the boat, the sole of her shoe slipped on the wet wood. She lost her balance, tipped sideways, and her right temple struck hard against the rim of the boat. The sound was dull and brief. Sparrow fell into the shallow water by the shore and lay still, eyes closed, unmoving. Briar screamed. The scream carried to the Whitfield house less than 100 meters away. Harold ran out first, shockingly fast for a man of 80. June followed. Ronan had been sitting on the porch reading emails when he heard the scream, and his reaction was faster than thought. He ran faster than Harold, faster than anyone, reaching the river in seconds. Sparrow lay in the shallows, water halfway up her body. Her head tilted to one side, blood seeping from a cut on her temple and mixing into the muddy water. Ronan plunged down, lifted her from the water, and laid her on the grass. His face went white. His hands shook as he checked her breathing. Sparrow was breathing but unconscious. Harper arrived 10 minutes later. She'd been asleep in her rented room after a night shift when Harold called, and she drove over with her hair unkempt and eyes barely awake. But her hands were steady the moment she touched the patient. She checked Sparrow's pupils, tested her reflexes, pressed gently around the head wound, then said they needed to go to the hospital immediately. It could be a concussion. Ronan carried Sparrow to the car. Harper sat in the back seat, stabilizing her head. Harold and June followed in their own car. Briar cried nonstop in the passenger seat of her grandparents' car. The Grafton Community Hospital, the same hospital where Harper worked nights, took Sparrow into the emergency room. The doctor ordered imaging and examined her. A mild concussion, a superficial laceration, no intracranial bleeding. Sparrow needed observation and rest. Ronan sat beside the bed and didn't move, both hands holding one of Sparrow's, his eyes fixed on her face, and he couldn't breathe evenly until the doctor said she was out of danger. Sparrow was unconscious for 4 hours. When she opened her eyes, it was dark outside. Pale white light filled the hospital room. Ronan was still there, his hand still holding hers. Harper stood at the foot of the bed. Harold and June sat in the hallway. Sparrow blinked, looked at the ceiling, then turned to Ronan, and her eyes changed. Not gradually, abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch in a room sealed shut for 8 years. Her eyes widened, pupils dilated. Her whole body went rigid. She stared at Ronan like she was seeing a ghost. Then she saw something else. She smelled coffee. Not hospital coffee, but coffee from a kitchen with marble floors. Coffee brewed at 5 in the morning, mixed with the smell of pancakes and star-shaped slices of banana. She heard a low voice, a man's voice singing to her every night, a lullaby she couldn't name but remembered every note of. She saw a room with butterfly sheets, Mr. Honey the teddy bear, a crayon drawing on the wall. She saw a mansion, stairs, a garden with flowers, a purple plastic cup, and then she saw the bridge. Darkness, cold wind, hands gripping her wrists and then letting go. The sound of water. The memories didn't return in fragments. They crashed back all at once, like a dam breaking, like a flood with no warning. 8 years locked behind traumatic brain injury pouring out in seconds. Sparrow screamed. It wasn't the scream of a child in pain. It was the scream of someone who had just remembered she almost died. "Daddy!" she screamed, eyes locked on Ronan. And it was the first time the word had left her mouth in 8 years. "Daddy, I remember now. I remember everything. My name is Lila. Daddy." She dropped me in the river. She let go of me. Ronan stopped breathing. He sat there holding his daughter's hand. Hearing the words he'd waited 8 years for and feared more than anything in the world, she remembered. She remembered everything. And she remembered who had done it. He pulled Lila into his arms. She clung to him, shaking, sobbing, her whole body trembling. He cried, not silently, like he had on the dirt road outside the Whitfield house. This time, he cried out loud, the sobs of a man whose restraint shattered after 8 years in a small hospital room in a town of 700 people. Father and daughter held each other on the hospital bed, and no one in the room dared to speak. In the hallway, Harold leaned against the wall, one hand covering his eyes. June sat on a plastic chair, both hands over her face, shoulders shaking. Briar stood beside her, crying too, even though she didn't fully understand what was happening. And in the corner of the room, Harper Callaway stood motionless, with her back against the wall, arms hanging at her sides, tears streaming down her cheeks without her wiping them away. She watched the father hold the daughter she had pulled from black water 8 years earlier, and she understood that the circle had closed. The child she had refused to let go of that night had finally found her way home. When Lila stopped crying long enough to speak, she told everything, every detail. The falsely gentle tone in Victoria's voice that morning, the drive toward the outskirts, the road growing emptier, the bridge, the cold wind, the words Victoria said, "You ruined my life," and the hands that let go. Lila spoke with a trembling but steady voice, like someone reading from a torn diary page she had just found again. Ronan listened. He didn't interrupt. didn't ask questions, didn't move. But Harper, sitting across from him, saw what was happening on his face. It wasn't ordinary anger. There was no clenched jaw, no reddened eyes, no fists tightening. Instead, Ronan's expression went completely flat like a frozen lake, and that was the most terrifying thing Harper had ever seen, because she realized he wasn't trying to restrain his rage. He was letting it freeze into something colder, more precise, and more lethal. When Lila finished, Ronan stood up, took out his phone, dialed Kieran, and said 3 words in a voice Harper had never heard him use, a voice stripped of emotion and flat as metal. "Bring Victoria here." Harper stood and followed him into the hallway, grabbed his wrist and pulled him back. Her hand was small on his wrist, but he stopped. "Not in front of the child," Harper said, her voice quiet but firm. "Whatever you're going to do, don't do it here. Not now, and not in front of Lila." Victoria out of the Gold Coast mansion and dragging her back to the car. Victoria out of the Gold Coast mansion and take her somewhere no one would hear the screams. He could do that. He'd done worse for far smaller offenses. Then Lila's voice came from the hospital room, soft, exhausted, but clear. "Daddy." He turned back. Lila looked at him from the bed, eyes swollen red, hair tangled, a white bandage wrapped around her head, and she said, "Daddy, I don't want you to become someone like her." Ronan stood still in the hallway. That sentence pierced him deeper than any bullet ever could. His daughter, the child thrown into a river 8 years ago, the child who had just remembered everything, wasn't asking for revenge. She was asking him not to become a monster. He closed his eyes for 10 seconds, then 20, then opened them, looked at Harper and said, "Call Paige." Paige Holloway arrived in Grafton the next morning on the earliest flight out of Chicago, carrying a thick case file, her laptop, and the sharp focus of a lawyer who had been preparing for this moment longer than she admitted. Ronan sat across from Paige in the motel room and said, "I want Victoria to pay, but through the law." Paige nodded without surprise, though inside she knew this was the biggest decision Ronan Voss had ever made, because he was choosing a path he couldn't control, one where the outcome rested with judges and juries instead of his own hands. Paige worked for 48 hours without sleep, compiling everything. The Grafton medical records, Harper's testimony about the night she pulled Lila from the river, Harold and June's statements about raising Sparrow for 8 years, the diagnosis of total amnesia, and most importantly, the direct testimony of Lila Voss herself, the victim who now remembered every detail of the night Victoria Ashworth let her go into the water. Paige submitted the entire file to the Cook County State's attorney. The charge was attempted murder of a minor under Illinois criminal law with a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in prison. Victoria Ashworth was arrested at the Gold Coast mansion at 6 in the morning on the 3rd day after Lila's memories returned. County police arrived with a warrant and handcuffed her in her bedroom. Victoria didn't resist. She cried, not from fear of prison, but because after 8 years of waiting for this moment, it had finally come. And she realized that some part of her felt relief at no longer having to hide. But Victoria wasn't the only one arrested. Paige dug deeper. With the help of the private investigators funded by Ronan, she traced the entire cover-up. The erased cameras, the transferred detective, the obstructed NCMEC reports, every thread leading back to one man, Victor Ashworth. Victor's crimes weren't state charges: bribery of law enforcement, obstruction of federal justice, abuse of political power as a former state senator. These were federal offenses under FBI jurisdiction. Paige sent all the evidence to the Chicago field office of the FBI. 2 weeks later, Victor Ashworth was arrested at his Winnetka mansion on Chicago's North Side by 4 FBI agents at 7 in the morning. The charges were obstruction of justice, bribery of law enforcement, and conspiracy to conceal a felony. He was handcuffed in front of his wife and his private attorney. And for the first time in his life, former Senator Victor Ashworth learned that there were forms of power that connections couldn't buy. The news spread across Chicago television like wildfire. A former state senator arrested for covering up his daughter's crime. The second wife of a real estate magnate prosecuted for attempting to murder her stepdaughter. Ronan didn't appear before the media. He stayed in Grafton sitting beside Lila's bed. And when Kieran called to say Victor had been arrested, he simply said, "All right." Hung up, turned to his daughter and asked, "What do you want for dinner tonight?" 3 months after the day Victoria was arrested, Paige called Ronan with news no one had anticipated. Victoria was dying. The lupus she had carried for years had ravaged her kidneys to the point that both were nearly shut down. She had been transferred from her cell to the medical unit of Cook County Jail, lying in a hospital bed connected to dialysis, and the prison doctor said she wouldn't make it through the month. Ronan listened without speaking. He felt no joy, no grief, no satisfaction. He simply hung up and told Lila because she had the right to know. Lila sat very still for a long time after hearing it. She was at the Whitfield house on the porch, her familiar sketchbook on her lap, but the pencil didn't move. She looked out at the river at the slow-moving surface under the afternoon light and thought. Ronan sat beside her and didn't rush her. Harper was in the kitchen helping June cook, but her eyes kept drifting toward the porch. Then Lila said, "I want to see her." Ronan didn't answer right away. Inside him, everything wanted to say no. Every muscle, every cell, every instinct of a father wanted to keep his daughter as far from Victoria Ashworth as possible, even if that woman was lying in a prison hospital bed waiting to die. But he looked into Lila's eyes and saw what he had been seeing for 3 months, a weight no 14-year-old should have to carry. The returning memories hadn't brought only the truth. They had brought anger, fear, and the question why that Lila turned over in her mind every night before sleep. Why did she hate me? What did I do wrong? Harper was the one who said to Ronan, "Let her go. She needs to close this door with her own hands. No one can do it for her." Ronan agreed. Paige arranged it with Cook County Jail. A week later, Ronan drove Lila to Chicago. Harper went with them because Lila asked her to come, and Harper never refused Lila anything. The medical unit of Cook County Jail sat on the ground floor of the segregation wing. Harsh white lights, narrow corridors, the smell of disinfectant mixed with dampness. Ronan stopped outside. He said, "I can't go in." Not because he wasn't allowed. He couldn't go in because he didn't know what he would feel if he saw Victoria now, and he didn't want Lila to see any of it. Harper walked Lila to the door of the room and stopped. She looked at Lila and said, "I'll wait here. You go in." Lila nodded, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. Victoria Ashworth lay in the prison hospital bed, much smaller than the woman Lila remembered. Her hair was almost gone, her skin sallow, her eyes sunken, her arms threaded with tubes and dialysis lines. She turned her head at the sound of the door, and when she saw Lila, her eyes widened. She tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. "Lila." Lila walked to the bedside. She didn't sit. She stood looking down at the woman who had thrown her from a bridge 8 years earlier, and she didn't see a monster. She saw someone dying. Skin stretched over bone, tethered to machines, curled on the bed like a child. Lila said, her voice soft but steady, "I remember everything now. I remember that morning. I remember you calling me with that gentle voice. I remember the drive toward the outskirts. I remember the bridge. I remember you saying I ruined your life. And I remember you letting go." Victoria closed her eyes. Tears slipped from the corners of her sunken eyes onto the pillow, but she made no sound. Lila continued, "For 8 years, I remembered nothing. I didn't know who I was or where I came from. I grew up with that question every day, but I also grew up with the Whitfields, with Harper, with people who loved me without needing a reason. And I had a life. Not a perfect one, but a life." Lila paused, swallowed, then went on. "I hated you. For 3 months since my memories came back, I hated you every day. Every night I dreamed of the bridge and woke up hating you. But now I look at you and I see what hatred has done to you. It ate you from the inside. It turned you into the person lying in this bed. And I don't want to live like that. I don't want to carry what you carried your whole life." Victoria opened her eyes, looked at Lila, and sobbed, a dry, broken sound from someone too weak to truly cry. "You're better than me," she whispered. "You were always better than me." Lila looked at her and said, "I forgive you." Then she added slower and clearer, as if speaking more to herself than to Victoria. "But I forgive myself, not you. I forgive myself because I don't want to carry this anymore." Victoria closed her eyes. A final tear slid down. Lila stood there another minute, then turned and walked out, closing the door behind her. In the hallway, Harper was waiting. She didn't ask anything. She simply opened her arms and Lila stepped into them, resting her head against Harper's chest, and breathed, not crying, just breathing. Victoria Ashworth died 4 days later at 3 a.m. in the medical unit of Cook County Jail. No one was with her, not her father, because Victor was awaiting trial in federal custody, not her husband because Ronan was no longer her husband, only the man she had betrayed in the most brutal way possible. The prison nurse recorded the time of death, pulled the white sheet up, and turned off the dialysis machine. No noise, no drama, just silence. Like the river that night had swallowed Lila's screams and flowed on as if nothing had happened. Victoria's death came and went with the outside world barely noticing. And in Grafton that morning, Lila woke up, looked out the window, saw sparrows on the tree branch, and for the first time in 3 months, she didn't dream of the bridge. 1 week after Victoria died, Ronan stood at the door of the small rented room above the old bookstore in Grafton and said to Harper, "Come to Chicago with me." Harper leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, looking at him with the eyes he had grown used to over the past months, but had never fully learned to read, and she shook her head. "I don't belong to your world, Ronan. You know that." Ronan didn't plead. He wasn't a man who pleaded, and he respected Harper too much to turn her refusal into a negotiation. He nodded, said the child would miss her, then turned and walked down the stairs. Harper stood in the doorway watching until the car disappeared at the end of the street, then went back inside, closed the door, sat on the bed, and stared at the wall for a long time without doing anything. Ronan returned to Chicago and brought Lila back to the penthouse at Voss Tower. She had a new room, but he kept the old one exactly as it was, the small bed, the butterfly sheets. Mr. Honey. Lila didn't sleep there. She had outgrown the bed, but sometimes she opened the door, sat on the floor, and hugged the teddy bear the way she used to when she was little and had only just remembered again. Ronan went back to running the empire. Kieran was still there, loyal like a shadow. Everything functioned as usual, but something wasn't usual. Every week, a shipment went from Chicago to Grafton. Not flowers, not jewelry, not romantic gifts. The first week, it was 3 crates of medication for the community hospital. Exactly the kinds Harper had once complained were always in short supply. The second week, it was new medical textbooks and professional journals Harper couldn't afford subscriptions to. The third week, it was medical supplies, gloves, gauze, suturing kits, things the small hospital in a town of 700 people always lacked but never had the budget to order. The fourth week, it was sketchbooks, colored pencils, and professional drawing paper sent to the Whitfield house for Sparrow, along with back pain medicine for Harold and herbal tea for June. With meticulous precision, and understood that the sender wasn't sending what he wanted her to have. He was sending what she needed and had never dared ask anyone for. That was how Ronan Voss said the things he didn't know how to say out loud. 3 months passed. Harper kept working night shifts, kept visiting the Whitfields every week, kept living the life she had lived for 8 years. But every night when she drove to the hospital and didn't see the familiar car parked at the edge of the lot, something was missing that she couldn't fill. Then one night, her phone rang. It was Lila. The girl's voice was small and anxious, exactly like the voice of a frightened 14-year-old rather than the strong young woman who had faced Victoria in prison. "Harper, Daddy isn't eating. Daddy isn't talking to anyone. Kieran says he sits in my old room every night and talks to himself like before he found me. Daddy needs you." Harper sat on the bed with the phone to her ear and closed her eyes. She thought of every reason not to go. She didn't belong in Chicago. She didn't belong in a world of penthouses and black SUVs. She was a night shift nurse in a small town, living in a room above an old bookstore, and that was her life. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the jacket hanging behind the door. The jacket she had wrapped around a soaked child by the riverbank 8 years earlier, and she stood up. Harper drove 7 hours through the night from Grafton to Chicago. She arrived at Voss Tower at 4 in the morning. The building's security wouldn't let her in. She called Kieran. Kieran came down to get her within 3 minutes, and in the elevator ride up, he didn't say anything, just looked at her and gave a small nod. The kind of nod Harper understood meant, "Thank you for coming." She stepped into the penthouse. Ronan was sitting in Lila's old room on the floor, his back against the small bed, Mr. Honey in his hands. He looked up at the sound of footsteps and saw Harper standing in the doorway. He didn't ask why she was there. She didn't explain. She walked in, sat down across from him on the floor, and looked at him. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Harper leaned forward slowly and rested her forehead against his. Ronan closed his eyes. Her forehead was warm. Her breathing was light and steady, carrying the faint scent of long road coffee. Then he tilted his head and his lips brushed hers, soft and brief, like a question. She didn't pull away. It was their first kiss, not fiery, not dramatic, not like a movie. Just two people who had carried too many wounds, finally allowing themselves to set them down beside each other. 1 year later, Ronan Voss withdrew completely from all illegal operations. The process wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but he did it step by step. Route by route, every shadow connection severed or handed off. Voss Holdings remained standing, legitimate, clean, and still one of the largest real estate groups south of Chicago. Lila attended a private school in the Gold Coast and sent drawings back to the Whitfields every weekend. Harold and June had a new house by the river in Grafton, built for them by Ronan, one story, larger than the old one, with a wide porch overlooking the dock. And Harold still went out to the river every morning, though now he fished for pleasure rather than necessity. Harper moved to Chicago. She worked as a nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital on day shifts. No more nights. She lived with Ronan and Lila in the penthouse at Voss Tower. But every month she still drove back to Grafton to visit Harold, June, and Briar. The promise she had kept for 8 years didn't stop just because the address changed. And every year, on the exact day that 8 years earlier, Victoria had driven toward the outskirts of Chicago, Lila returned to the old bridge south of the city. The bridge was still there, cracked concrete, rusted railings, rarely used. Lila stood on it, looking down at the river flowing beneath, and whispered, "Thank you for not swallowing me." Ronan stood behind her, one hand holding Harper's. He looked at his daughter, standing on the bridge where she had once fallen, and said softly, "The river remembers." Harper squeezed his hand tighter, watching Lila stand in the wind, brown curls flying, strong, alive, whole, and she said, "And so do I." The story ends here, but what it leaves behind doesn't. Sometimes life throws us into black water, takes our memory, takes our identity, takes everything we thought we were. But if we're lucky enough, there will be hands that pull us back to shore. There will be someone who swears not to let go. There will be elderly couples by a river who open their door and welcome us in without knowing who we are. And if we're brave enough, we'll learn that forgiveness isn't for the person who hurt us, but for ourselves, so we can be free. If this story touched something in your heart, please like the video, share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel to hear more meaningful stories every day. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel. Which part brought tears to your eyes? Which part made you think about your own life? Write it in the comments so we can listen to you from the depths of your heart. Because every comment you leave is the greatest motivation for us to keep bringing you powerful stories each day. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace and calm in every day ahead. Thank you so much. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.